Welcome to the Theology Nerd Podcast with the Dr. Tripp Fuller. This is a shorter Q&A episode where your friendly local internet theologian answers questions submitted by you. There are lots of ways you can submit a question for Tripp to answer. You can go to homebrewedchristianity.com, click the send voicemail button on the right-hand side near the scroll bar. You can also leave a 5-star review on iTunes and just put your question as the review. You can also tweet at Tripp Fuller, that's 2 P's and 2 L's. Or you can send an email with your question to mediaguru@homebrewedchristianity.com. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast and to our email list. That way you never miss out on new episodes or live events near you. Just go to homebrewedchristianity.com to learn more.
Hello, theology nerds, and today, Brian McLaren and I are going to be tackling a number of the questions you sent in, and this is from Andy. Andy asks, in the past 3 years, I've become more committed as a Christian and more progressive politically. I just don't understand the outrage culture online among progressive Christians. Why do we eat our own, virtue signal, and then get super judgy like it's a spiritual discipline? How can we do better?
I like Andy.
Yes.
Yeah. You know, Andy's question reminds me, Tripp, I met a woman who had been in Congress, a representative for one term, and she was Democrat. And she said, I asked her how she would summarize her experience in Congress. And she said, Republicans can agree on a lie and Democrats can't agree on the truth. and there's often this thing about, and I think there are many, many dimensions to it, but one of them is that the conservative mindset, part of what it's trying to conserve is patriarchy. And part of what patriarchy is about lining up behind the powerful white man in charge. And being willing to lie for him, being willing to, do whatever to protect the ego and power of the man in charge. And to the degree that progressives are trying to move away from that kind of patriarchy to a kind of democracy that equalizes everybody, it's predictable that there would be a good amount of an increased amount of difference on the more progressive side. Here's the problem. If people don't learn how to play well together and be on the same team and have, basic manners, we're in trouble. And then secondly, when people try to build up their own platform by tearing down somebody, there's the old holier than thou statement, but there's more liberal than thou, more woke than thou, more whatever. Obviously, that gets tiresome and ends up eroding the potential for movement. So I don't know. What would you say about that?
I would just say that, like, if progressives thought just a little bit about how social science works, that a lot of the trying to out-progressive each other in the most, annoying way on the internet is actually real bad for changing people's minds. Shaming someone is a somewhat effective tool in interpersonal, them relationships, right? If you look at your best friend and say, look, you realize the kind of assumptions that are just bothering me in what you just said? That can be a tool. But to randomly tweet people, a Southern Baptist who's considering climate change for the first time, or might possibly not say stupid stuff about our gay brothers and sisters or something like that, right? Yeah. And then be like, yeah, well, you should be even more progressive. That doesn't end up helping. And I think that, I get what Andy's question is. And I think part of doing better for me has been, I need to have a big enough vision of faith that I am graceful to all the previous versions of me. And I was an obnoxious Calvinist. When my family are Baptists, and they're particular Baptists and general Baptists. Particular Baptists are in the Reformed tradition. I read I read Spurgeon sermons for devotionals.
Yes.
And I thought I was edgy for certain reasons now that I'm like, that's nice, Tripp. But if you can cultivate a generous, love for your previous selves, then you can start to realize that a lot of the people you want to come down on and critique are on a journey in the same way you've been. And you're more likely to play a positive role in their growth if you're their friend or someone who just listens well and challenges with a kind ear than an aggressive one. And I guess for me, and this is something I'd be interested in what you think, Brian, like to me, there are certain issues that are important enough. It's okay to make people really uncomfortable. Like, I feel like the way race relations are working in the United States and the way white privilege has protected itself, that's a different issue for me than others. And climate change as an issue that is essential to the future of humanity, is something that I feel more comfortable being pushy on than, kind of like doctrinal disputes or even how you see different elements of church battles playing out. But I understand Andy's frustration.
Yes. And a huge part of this is a particular disease of the internet where at some level we all have to acknowledge the desire for more likes or retweets or whatever it is, drives us and can be so destructive to the ethic that we espouse if we're progressive Christians. There's a sort of principle of social psychology called complementarity, which in that context means that if you treat someone else well, they tend to want to treat you well. And if you shame someone, they tend to want to shame you back. So it's people do to you what you do to them, which is why, Jesus called to do unto others as you would have them do to you is a flipping of negative complementarity. And so it just seems to me this becomes a special opportunity for all of us who are, progressive people of faith, is that we would try to disagree with people in a way that they think, wow, I've never been disagreed with that thoughtfully before, that politely before. Just a quick anecdote. I had two experiences that were sort of parallel but very different. Early on, I grew up evangelical, and when I first started speaking in more sort of mainline or progressive settings, I remember someone came up to me and kind of mugged me and said, I notice you refer to God as he. You understand that's perpetuating the patriarchy. It's very hard for me to listen to anybody who still refers to God as he. And, the truth is I don't refer to God as he anymore. I changed in spite of that person's negative mugging of me, right?
Yeah.
Then a couple years ago, I was in another setting and a person came up to me after I spoke and said, I noticed you kept referring to brothers and sisters, brothers and sisters, brothers and sisters. She said, I found that really warm and friendly. She said, but I have to tell you, I'm a gender non-binary person. And if you want to be more sensitive to people like me, you might say brothers and sisters and friends, or you might just find a way that always linguistically includes. Well, she did that so graciously, right? That made it really easy to move in her direction. So all that's to say, it's a lesson I fail at very often, but I think we all can. Andy's question makes us all want to take a couple steps in the right direction, I think.
All right, theology nerds, the question from Jessica is, what is the point of Christianity, assuming you don't really believe people go to hell?
So this is Jessica's question, is a great one. And there's all kinds of fun I would like to have with that question. The first thing I would like to say is, no, listen, it's not that I don't think people don't go to hell. It's I think a whole lot of people are already in hell. They're in the hell of war. They're in the hell of poverty. They're in the hell of oppression. They're in the hell of rejection. And God isn't the torturer in this hell. Human beings are. But what happened in traditional Christianity is the word salvation. I think we twisted the word out of its Jewish roots And we held it hostage and gave it another definition, so that salvation meant rescuing people from original sin, total depravity, and a predestination to eternal conscious torment in hell. That's how we became so clear in our definition of hell. By the way, not just evangelicals and fundamentalists. This goes deep back into Western Christian history, as you well know, Tripp. So I think what happens is, if we rediscover the original, the Jewish meaning of salvation as primarily liberation, setting people free from the oppressions of human evil, including our own self-oppression, then suddenly the point of Christianity becomes gloriously simple. It's the salvation of the world, meaning the liberation of the world, meaning liberation of all people, but also liberation of the ecosystems from human oppression and so on. This full liberation into shalom and well-being. That's a pretty good point, it seems to me.
Yeah, and for me, I think there's a sense that if you grew up in the primary motivating structure of worship, of piety, of your faith and stuff, was I deserved eternal conscious torment, I didn't get it, and now we're working so other people can avoid it, then what's the point of Christianity? Question lingers different, right? Which I think is kind of the snarkiness at the end of Jessica's question comes from. And that's a real challenge for people that moving past that. I know that having worked at churches where that would have been a past that was predominantly shared, then working at mainline churches in California where a significant less number of people had that experience, I kind of would back into the question and think, I had a group of college students and we did an experiment of not judging for a month. And we had come up with a prayer in a text group. And anytime you judge someone during the week, you would text the name and everyone would pray a blessing for that person. And over the course of the month, the names that were texted most frequently were individuals texting their own name. And to pray the affirmation you prayed at the beginning of it, like when Jesus says, "Oh, don't judge," we realize that, yes, we can all learn to relate more lovingly and graciously towards each other, but at the heart of it is our inability to see ourselves as known and loved completely by God. And so, part of the point of Christianity, to me, is that the most true thing about you is that you're God's beloved. Yes. And it's true about your neighbor and your enemy. But we'll never learn to live in that shalom. We'll never learn to live in a self-giving and self-affirming and self-liberating way. We'll never be in a community that commits itself to that way of life until that deep, divine, eternal affirmation is received. And yes. and in the story of Christianity, and I think the heart of the gospel is that is our identity.
Yes.
And the biggest practices we have, baptism and the Eucharist, are retelling us that story all the time.
Yes.
And that's the identity we're called to live out. So, and I don't think, I honestly think the idea that God, who knows us and loves us completely, could postulate anyone existing eternally in conscious torment undermines the actual beautiful truth at the heart of the gospel. And so moving past that idea is a good thing, because it's hard to imagine that God loves it. It's hard to imagine loving our enemies if God doesn't, so.
Yes. If anybody's interested in this, I wrote a book on a subject called The Last Word and the Word After That. And it could be helpful to people grappling with this. But let's flip it. Could we flip the question one more time?
Yeah.
Tripp, because if it was Jessica who asked the question.
Yeah.
There's a way that an honest answer to Jessica's question would be, if she said, "What's the point of Christianity?" Well, we'd have to say, depends on which Christianity you're talking about. The point of some Christianity is to keep white men who are gatekeepers of a tradition in their position of power. That's the point. Another point, to keep white people in power in general. Another point, to keep justifying a certain corporate plunder and profit scheme, and to give it moral legitimacy. Another point, in other words, there are a lot of points of Christianity. And the terrible thing is that the heaven and hell narrative can be a camouflage for an awful lot of other points. Then to flip it one more time, it seems to me that some people would say, look, you're too late. Christianity has already defined itself. Its point is heaven and hell, and people like you are just hopeless in trying to make it a change. You might be right about the original meaning of the word salvation as liberation. But it's too late. These things are defined. The institutions own the word Christianity, and so on. And so the only thing I'd say, if someone asks, what's the point of Christianity in that way, is to say, listen, what's the point of human beings? Human beings have been about violence. Human beings have been about domination. In other words, anything we say about Christianity is basically a reflection of human beings. And unless we want to give up on human beings, then we might as well have hope that the point of anything can change for the better. And that's what our desire would be. I think when I interrogate my own fundamentalist past, one of the reasons we emphasize the heaven and hell narrative so deeply is because we needed a reason to say that our religion was supreme and superior to all other religions. I didn't know why I needed that. Now I realize I needed that because I was a privileged member of Western civilization, and we had a 500-year colonial project going on, and we desperately needed to reinforce our moral superiority, our exceptionalism, and our supremacy. So having the supreme religion, the one true religion, was our huge asset. Now, when you begin to interrogate that and you lose confidence in that, and in fact, you become that narrative becomes repulsive to you, then you can say, for Christianity to have a real point and make a real contribution to the world does not require it being superior to and supreme over other religions. It does require looking for allies and colleagues in all religious communities. So at any rate, that's part of what I think you find
that actually reminds me of this. I spoke at it was like a gathering for secular humanists, and they asked me to preach, and but on a secular text, and I picked Plato because that I'm a philosopher, and so I preached on Plato, got done, and then they asked me questions, but almost all of them were like, I really loved what you said, and so how are you a Christian minister?
Yes.
Yeah, and I said, if you don't think it's going to come across like witnessing, I'll just tell you about my faith. And I told him, and one of the respondents said something to me that was really helpful. He said, when you tell about your experience with Christ and the Christian community, it sounded like a friend of mine who I thought really should get married, because it's clear that that's a relationship that matters so much to you. Your friend should just say, yeah, Tripp, you should be a Christian. Like, you should be with Jesus all the time. And it's beautiful, and I affirm it, and I think it's great for all that comes in your life, and I don't think you make sense without it. And I mean, I wish my parents had known that Jesus. That would have been helpful. But, like, I'm really glad. And I hadn't thought of it that way, where no one, like, when you told me about you and Grace's relationship, I can totally go, that's a loving relationship and essential for you both as human beings, being who you are and blessing each other. And you don't think I'm going to fall in love with her immediately. And me not falling in love with her immediately is somehow offensive and degrading to the reality of that relationship.
Yeah.
And I thought, yeah, that, you can always invite people into it. But there's that subjective side of faith that is part of any relationship that it like, that's just not something you wield like a weapon. And ever since I had that experience, I thought, it makes more sense in a pluralist society to see it that way, because like, he wasn't saying, I agree with you about the reality of God or anything. He was saying it like the mystery at the heart of your subjectivity should be narrated that way, and it makes sense to me. Yes.
What a perceptive and respectful humanist that was, to see that way. And it shows, that he had moved beyond a kind of fundamentalist humanism that says because this is the way I see the world, you have to interpret the world the same way. He used what was true and to his way of interpreting the world to, in a sense, give him empathy to see the world through your perspective and see you in that context. That to me is a great definition of what it means to be a loving human being. And that's great.